And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to the Militia Roundtable. That is militiaradio.com. Tonight, our guest is Clif from halfpasthuman.com. He's linked up on militiaradio.com, so you can go to either site and read his bio there. How you doing, Clif?
Doing pretty good. It's a pleasant day, not too hot here. We're shading back into cool weather for a bit, and that suits us here on the western side of the Pacific Northwest, where we get a lot of rain and cool temps.
Great. And we also, Connor's with us tonight. I don't know if Politica stayed on, and Mini 14's with us. I'm going to jump right in. Clif has a very special project that he developed, and I'm not going to even try to explain it to everybody. I'll let him do it, but everybody should be taking notes on this, pay close attention to what's going on, and I'll let Clif give you his bio and what the WebBot project is all about.
Okay, I'm a software programmer. I started off as a programmer and worked my way up through into software engineering. And while working for a giant software company, I had a few ideas based on the kind of problems they continually encountered. And I got to the idea, this was about before the beginning of the Internet, I started thinking about how language is stored in computers and language in general, and gradually shifted over from being a software engineer to being what I call a radical linguist. Because it occurred to me that after the Internet really took off, say in the late 80s, early 90s, and I started seeing certain trends develop in how language was used at the various spots that people congregated on the Internet, it occurred to me that there was no reason for language changes to be exhibited the way I had seen them online. That rather, basically it was all these people at a bread forum talking about bread. And why should the language change really from one set to another set over time? And so I got curious about all of this and started investigating it. In order to investigate it, I had to write some software to go out and grab big hunks of language and haul it back. And one thing led to another, and I got to the idea that, I think all these guys are psychic, and that a certain amount of psychic intuition is leaking out of people in the word choices that they use in their daily activities. And that psychic intuition, if I could collect enough of it, might be meaningful. And at first I thought, one way to deal with this would be to use it to get all the information I could about a particular stock and the words around that stock online in terms of how people were discussing it. And thus, maybe I could get a direction as to get some ideas to whether people would, in general, in let's to say in large masses, go out and either buy that stock or sell it. And if I knew ahead of time, I theoretically could make some money on this. Because it occurred to me, of course, that late in life, that the stock market was not based on anything factual, but was entirely driven by emotion. Something that had escaped my notice for a long time. Anyway, though, in rooting around looking for, in 1997, when I really got a lot of the code developed that would do some aggregation of all of the large masses of data and boil them down into a thick, syrupy mass to play with, started hunting for information around a stock called Sun, S-U-N, for Stanford University Network. And it was a computing company, something I knew about, so I felt comfortable in dealing with it. And I kept getting all these weird references to the sun, the big scary ball of fire in the sky, not Sun, the computing company. And it kind of like was a whole lot more intriguing than dealing with the stocks, which really was, once I'd achieved my goal of getting the language back, I was kind of bored with dealing with the stocks because I was not much of a stock trader or anything, and my idea was to sell the software rather than go and trade stocks. But in any event, I started getting intriguing glimpses that people were basically exhibiting fear language around the sun. And I thought, why should this be? And this was in 1997, and then 3 years later, we had the solar, into the year 2000, we had the solar pole flip into this current new solar cycle, which has proved to be abnormal in all respects. And I had a warning on this as early as 1997. Now, of course, I kept up with the project and tried to support myself with other methods from 97 until about 2003 when I took the project on full time. Around 2001, we made a prediction which we put on George Uhr's urbansurvival.com site that I called Screwy Theory 153. I had this little habit at the time of maintaining a book and writing down all these weird ideas that I had and numbering them as I went along. And basically what we called the WebBot project was Theory 153. And so I labeled it that. We put it on George's site in, I think, July 10th or 12th of 2001, predicting a tipping point that would change all of our lives forever, and that tipping point was being forecast to occur within 90 days of that date that we posted. I actually thought it would be closer to the July date than further out, but it was because I had my numeric system reversed. I was just guessing at things at that stage. And anyway, that proved to be the 9/11 attacks that changed everything forever and put us into a whole new world. Sort of makes sense.
Oh, yeah. I'm following it. So from there, you decided to refine it each time?
Correct. There's a curious little property here that basically what I do is I try and track emotional releases that are put online. In order to do this, I went ahead and got this dictionary, or a lexicon actually, it's just a word list, no definitions, a word list from the Oxford English dictionary that they use for the electronic version. A friend of mine was working there at the time and just gave me a list of all the words. And I went along and I assigned numeric values to all of the words based on where I thought the word was in this emotional scale. And it was just a guess to start. And so it's been what's called a Delphi process, where you just take a stab at it, run it, and then refine that process based on how it fails. And then run it again and refine it and keep going, and eventually it gets pretty good. And that's what we've been doing over the past 10 years, is reassigning the emotional values each time that we get real language showing up based around our forecast. So, for instance, we forecast last year the Chinese quake, and we put a heads up. We actually forecasted about 6 months in advance, and then I think 36 hours before it occurred, we put out a warning. And George, you picked that warning up on and put it out 28 hours before the actual quake occurred. And then the quake occurred, and then I was able to gather all the language that showed up in the newspapers around the planet around the Chinese quake, and then go back and match the words up for the words that I had said would appear, and then I could make this tuning process a lot better. And so it led to the ability to make a forecast that I put on Coast to Coast with George Noory on July 21st, that we would have 2 earthquakes on the 3rd and the 4th of August, and indeed we did. We had the earthquakes swarm in Baja, and then we also had one in Japan. Now, admittedly, I missed the one in Japan because the international dateline, it was actually August 5th, but nonetheless it occurred when most of us here in the United States were still in August 4th. So it was kind of half there and half not. Again, sort of makes sense. It's based on language appearing in the aftermath of an event as opposed to an actual description of an event. And that's where our stuff kind of like differs from prophecy. We're not saying we have a vision of an event. Rather, we're saying we have a hint of a vision through a dark kind of a glass of the words that will be used in the media to describe the event after it happens.
So what kind of success rate are you guys running?
Well, that again is a matter of interpretation, because basically what we do is we provide a bunch of words that say these are the words that will be associated with that event, or with this series of events, or with this particular time in history. And we think we're doing better than chance would allow. So we're better than chance. I think we're better than chance by about twice as good. So if chance were 25%, then we're at 50%. There's a lot of people that claim that we have a higher level of percentage of hits, and they may be more correct than I am, but I've never had the opportunity to go back and make a cross match with stuff other than on the big big forecast that worked out. Then there's another aspect of it, and that is that when we're correct, we can be spectacularly correct. An example of that is the Northeast power outage. That was a few years back. We forecast that 3 weeks in advance, and we put out tons of language relatively, a couple of hundred words relative to describe the situation. And boy, didn't all those words show up relative to the thing 3 weeks later. So we were just spot on. I think we had 99% of those linguistics actually work out and become fulfilled in our terminology. Now, on the other hand, we can also be right in the main and wrong in the details. And an example of that is the Columbia spaceship disaster that came down over Palestine. We had a lot of the language at a high level that kept bugging us, that was describing this big emotional release that we described as a giant marine disaster. And we had some language describing the breakup of the ship, and we had some language associating it with areas of the planet that would be, one might think of as having historical associations that are pan-cultural. And in this instance, what happened was it wasn't an actual ship. It was Columbia, but Columbia comes into the ocean because it's Columbia Gem of the Ocean, the song, and there's also the spaceship component of it. So there's a lot of terminology that is shared between the space industry and the marine industry. So we were sort of half right. We were right about the accident component. We were even right about some of the debris which came down in Palestine, Texas, which is not far from Palestine, which has, in terms of how the language is looking at it, and has historical associations. So we got the main idea correct and the timing correct and totally blew all the details on that one. But on the other hand, we occasionally get them just so spectacularly right, like the Chinese quake. The one thing about the Chinese quake was that we said that there would be a lot of press coverage relative to interrupted weddings. And the quake happened and then nothing. And it took 2 weeks for the photos to come out of this church right near the quake epicenter that is used entirely for weddings and had dozens of brides and grooms in it that were trapped, and they had to climb out of the rubble in all of their wedding finery. And there was all kinds of emotional images around this and all kinds of language that came out 2 weeks later. So frequently it will occur that when we are correct with a lot of the language, it just takes a while to actually hit the mainstream press. There's this lag time that we can't really account for. Make sense?
Right. Oh, yeah. And I understand. I mean, you're kind of playing with words, and you see something coming up, and you have to interpret it as best you can. Well, I'm going to jump really forward.
Sure.
Because I really want to get into your latest report, and please tell everybody how they can get their own copy and why you think it's so vital that everybody should have a copy. And
well, actually, I don't. I don't think that everybody should necessarily have a copy because there's a whole lot of people that necessarily would not be moved to action. But it's a very dire bit of writing, especially if you consider that we might be accurate in some of the forecasts that are within the report. But if someone wanted to get hold of it, they can go to halfpasthuman.com, and you'll find a Buy Now button on there. For $10, you can buy our report, which I think runs about 40-plus pages. And it's delivered electronically in a PDF format. And we also have an address. If you don't want to use PayPal, you can send us a check, and we'll send it to you as long as you send us your email address, because we've got to have that. We do only deliver electronically, no hard copies. But basically, the report describes the immediate future that, let's say, extends from right now all the way through to about November of 2010, and then some hints of what may happen beyond 2010. We need to digress for a second, and let me point out that we have this problem with it, or not a problem, but an artifact of our processing is that we don't have a clear view out a distance. Our best view comes from what we call the immediacy data, which is effective from 3 days out to about 3 weeks. Our next best view is from 3 weeks out to about 3 to 4 months, shading out to about 6 months. And then the least amount of data we have is in the long term, which goes from about 4 months out to 19 months, but it sort of trails off. So it's kind of as though we've got a spotting scope or a pair of binoculars that vision gets weaker the further away you look at it. But if you're looking real close, it's nice and sharp. Now, this report that we've got is concentrating really on the period of time from this fall through to fall of 2010, because so much is going to occur in that period of time within what we call the transformation metadata layer. In other words,